Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. After a night of heavy rain, the cement path in the yard is still soft. The kitchen stove has just cracked dangerously, and at the same moment, Toan receives an urgent message. If he doesn't meet the construction manager tonight, the job opportunity will be gone. Between a fragile home that still needs repairs and the pressure to earn money, Toan must make a difficult choice. Now, let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem. Can they get through this risky day and protect the small home they are trying to rebuild? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Morning arrived slowly after a long night without electricity. The air in the yard still carried the heavy smell of damp soil after the storm. When the wooden door opened, Toan stepped onto the porch and stopped immediately. The cement walkway he had poured yesterday had not fully hardened. The surface was still soft, and near the stove corner, a small section had sunk slightly because rainwater had pooled there during the night. He crouched down and touched the ground with his hand. The cement was still moist and left a faint imprint of his fingers. If someone stepped too firmly on it, the entire section could crack and would need to be repaired again. Behind him, Tu Diem stepped into the yard, carrying a basket of tomatoes she had picked early that morning. The red tomatoes still held traces of dew. She walked toward the cement path, but stopped when she noticed Toan's footprint on the soft surface. She looked at him, then down at the ground. It was only a short stretch across the yard, yet this morning it had become an obstacle. If they walked around the side through the dirt patch, they would have to cross mud still slippery from the rain. But if they stepped directly onto the cement, the surface might be damaged. Toan stood up and looked toward the gate before speaking quietly. They would have to walk slowly. He stepped forward first, testing each spot carefully to check the firmness of the surface. Tu Diem followed behind him, holding the basket of tomatoes close to her body to reduce the weight pressing down on her steps. The distance across the yard was only a few meters, but it took them almost a full minute to cross it. When they finally reached the gate, both of them exhaled softly, as if they had just finished something more difficult than it appeared. The road to the market was still wet. Small puddles scattered across the dirt path. The morning air felt cool, but carried the heavy scent of wind after rain. Toan walked slightly ahead, occasionally turning back to check whether Tu Diem was slipping. The basket of tomatoes was heavy because today was the main harvest day. If they did not sell them early, the tomatoes could soften and lose value. They walked slowly but remained quiet. Both of them understood that today they needed cash to continue repairing the yard and reinforcing the stove. When they arrived at the market, the vegetable section was already busy. A few familiar vendors were arranging their goods. Tu Diem placed her basket of tomatoes onto an old scale. Hong, the vendor at the next stall, glanced over and picked up one of the tomatoes. She turned it slowly in her hand before mentioning that several tomatoes had been slightly bruised by the strong wind the previous night. The tone sounded casual, but the meaning was clear. She was trying to lower the price. Tu Diem looked into the basket. It was true that a few tomatoes had minor marks. If everything was sold together, the price would definitely drop. She was about to nod and accept the offer so they could finish quickly and return to the farm. But Toan stepped closer and examined the baskets carefully. He said they should separate the tomatoes. The good ones would be sold at the normal price, and the slightly damaged ones could be sold separately. He suggested weighing each group openly in front of everyone. Hong frowned slightly. A few nearby vendors turned to look. After a moment, she placed the tomato back into the basket and agreed. The atmosphere between the two stalls became unusually quiet. Tu Diem began sorting the tomatoes into two separate piles. The task was simple, but took extra time. When the first basket was weighed, the money was not much, but it allowed her to keep the proper value for the best tomatoes. While they were finishing the remaining portion, Toan's phone vibrated inside his pocket. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He stepped aside and answered the call. The voice on the other end reminded him about an old debt connected to his previous company. The voice was calm but firm. The man said they expected a response soon regarding payment. Toan stayed silent for a few seconds. He answered briefly that he was currently trying to arrange money and would contact them again. When he ended the call, he stood still for a moment. His eyes no longer looked at the phone, but at the ground. Tu Diem did not ask anything. She simply looked at him for a moment and continued tying the mouth of the tomato bag. Only a few minutes later, another call came. This time, it was from someone in their village. The man said the wind at the tomato field was getting stronger. One row of tomato trellises had begun to lean. If the wind increased further, the entire row might collapse. Toan looked at Tu Diem. Neither of them needed many words. If the trellis collapsed, at least 1/3 of the plants could break. That would mean nearly all their effort from the past several weeks would disappear. They quickly packed up the remaining tomatoes. The money they earned was not much, but it was still necessary. After tying the basket securely, they left the market faster than they had arrived. The road back to the field was still wet. The wind had begun to grow stronger. Branches along the roadside shook constantly. When they reached the field, one row of tomato trellises had already tilted to one side. Several bamboo stakes had loosened. The ropes were stretched tight. If they were any later, the entire structure might collapse. Toan immediately lifted the bamboo stakes back into place. He used his shoulder to hold the trellis upright while Tu Diem tied the ropes again. The work had to be done quickly because the wind kept blowing harder. After a few minutes, the trellis stood upright again. A few tomatoes had fallen to the ground, but most of the plants remained intact. Toan looked along the entire row and said they would need more bamboo stakes to reinforce everything. If they did not fix it immediately, the next strong wind could cause even more damage. On the way back home, Toan stopped at Tam's small supply store. Tam was known in the area for selling building materials. Toan asked to buy several bamboo stakes and a small amount of cement to reinforce the stove base. Tam leaned against the doorway and looked at him for a moment before speaking plainly. "If you want the materials, you pay first." The sentence was not loud, but it was clear enough. Toan understood that news about his lost company had already spread throughout the area. He explained slowly that he only needed a small amount for urgent repairs. Once he received new work, he would pay the rest. Tam thought about it for a few seconds before nodding, but he only allowed Toan to take a small portion of the materials. Just as Toan was about to leave, his phone vibrated again. This time it was Hai. Hai said a construction site was looking for someone to supervise work. If Toan could meet the manager that afternoon, he might be able to take the job immediately. The pay would be weekly. It was not a large amount, but it could be a start. Toan remained still for a few seconds after the call ended. He glanced at Tu Diem, who was tying the rope around the bamboo stakes they had just bought. On one side was a chance for new work. On the other was the farm and the house that still needed constant attention. When they arrived home, the wind had begun to pick up again. Tu Diem brought damp firewood to start the stove. The wood was still wet from the rain, so thick smoke rose quickly. When Toan placed a pot of water on top of the stove, he suddenly heard a faint cracking sound from below, near the old fracture line in the base. Both of them stopped immediately. Toan crouched down and examined the stove carefully. The crack was not large, but it was enough to send a chill through him. If more weight was placed there, the stove could collapse. He quickly lifted the pot away and used a few bricks to temporarily support the structure. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Toan glanced toward the cement path they had poured the previous day. The surface still had not fully hardened. His phone vibrated again in his pocket. A message from Ly appeared on the screen. "If you arrive late, they will give the job to someone else." Toan stood still for a few seconds after reading the message. Outside, the wind pushed against the tarp covering the firewood, making it flap sharply. He looked toward the gate and then back at the stove, which was temporarily supported by a few bricks. Work in the field was not finished. The cement walkway in the yard was still soft, and the stove had just made a cracking sound. But the job opportunity Ly mentioned might be the only chance for him to start rebuilding his life. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Tu Diem was still fanning the stove to keep the fire burning. Smoke rose upward, making her eyes slightly red. Toan said Ly had called again and told him to meet the construction manager that afternoon. If he arrived late, the job would be given to someone else. Tu Diem stayed quiet for a few seconds and then nodded. She told him he should go. She could manage things at home for now, but her voice still carried the fatigue of the long day. Toan looked out into the yard. The cement path was still damp. If it rained again during the night, the surface might become uneven before it hardened. He said before leaving he needed to reinforce the stove and secure the firewood cover. He took the bundle of bamboo stakes he had bought earlier and began driving 2 additional poles into the ground near the stove to support the roof cover. Each strike of the hammer echoed across the small yard. Tu Diem brought more rope and tied the tarp tighter. They worked quickly but carefully because the wind had not completely stopped. After securing everything, Toan checked the cement walkway again. He stepped lightly onto the surface. It felt slightly firmer than before, but was still soft near the corner by the stove. He used a shovel to add dry soil to the shallow dip, so rainwater would not collect there again. The small task took nearly half an hour. By the time he finished, the sky had already begun to darken. Toan washed his hands using a bucket of water near the porch and went inside to grab his old jacket. Tu Diem handed him a small flashlight. The road to the construction site would be dark at night. Before leaving, Toan looked back at the house once more. The stove was still supported by bricks. The firewood was covered properly. The cement walkway showed fresh marks from the soil he had just leveled. He told Tu Diem that if everything went well, he would return early that night. If it became too late, she should lock the door and rest. Tu Diem nodded and stood at the porch watching him walk away until his figure disappeared down the dirt road. The road toward the town was darker than usual because electricity had not fully returned after the storm. The beam from Toan's flashlight only illuminated a few meters ahead. He walked quickly but carefully since the ground was still slippery. When he arrived at the small cafe where Ly had asked him to meet, he saw Ly already sitting with a middle-aged man wearing construction clothes. Ly stood up and introduced Toan to the manager. The man asked several short questions about Toan's previous work experience. Toan explained clearly about the construction projects he had supervised when he was still running his company. The manager listened and nodded. He said the site currently needed someone experienced to monitor progress and construction quality. The job would start next week. The salary was not as high as what Toan had earned before, but it'd be paid weekly. Toan thought quietly for a few seconds and then agreed. The meeting did not last very long. After exchanging phone numbers and confirming the starting date, the manager stood up and left. Hai patted Toan on the shoulder and said at least this was a beginning. Toan nodded. He knew the road ahead was still long, but a stable job was exactly what he needed now. After saying goodbye to Hai, Toan immediately headed back home. The wind on the road had weakened. Some houses along the road had lights again, as electricity gradually returned. When Toan reached the gate, the small house was glowing under a soft yellow light. Tu Diem was sitting on the porch, sewing a loose rope that held the tarp in place. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Toan stepped into the yard and told her he had accepted the job. Next week, he would begin working at the construction site. Tu Diem smiled softly. It was not a big smile, but it was enough to ease the tension in the yard. Toan checked the stove once again. The temporary bricks were still holding the structure steady. He placed the pot of water back on top. This time there was no cracking sound. They decided to eat dinner a little later. The meal was simple: rice, a few tomatoes, and some grilled meat left from the previous day. They sat on a mat in the yard. The night wind had softened. After such a long day, neither of them spoke very much. Toan briefly described the new job. Tu Diem said she would go to the field early the next morning to check the tomato trellises again and harvest more fruit. After the meal, Toan stood up and checked the firewood tarp one last time. The wind had completely stopped. He tied one more knot in the rope just to be sure. Before going to sleep, he stepped into the yard and looked again at the cement walkway. The surface had hardened much more compared to the morning. He returned inside, turned off most of the lights, and lay down beside Tu Diem. Outside, the yard was finally quiet after the long day of wind. The difficult day had finally come to an end. But for the first time in months, Toan knew that tomorrow would begin with a clearer direction.
Sau một đêm mưa lớn, Toàn và Tu Diem bắt đầu ngày mới với nhiều lo lắng. Lối xi măng vừa đổ ngoài sân vẫn còn mềm, trong khi chân bếp xuất hiện vết nứt khiến việc nấu nướng trở nên nguy hiểm. Hai người phải ra chợ bán cà chua để có tiền sửa lại sân và gia cố bếp. Tại chợ, họ bị ép giá và Toàn còn nhận cuộc gọi nhắc nợ từ quá khứ. Khi đang xoay sở, tin báo từ ruộng cho biết giàn cà chua có nguy cơ đổ vì gió mạnh. Cả hai vội quay về cứu vườn. Giữa lúc mọi thứ còn dang dở, Toàn nhận được cơ hội công việc từ Hải. Anh phải quyết định rời nhà đi gặp quản lý công trình hay ở lại xử lý những rủi ro đang bủa vây.